Hello, my three subscribers. This is Emerald Green Eye here, coming to you again with another election prediction video. Although this one won't be a modern projection, this will be another alternate history. In 1968, what if Robert F. Kennedy, young brother of John F. Kennedy, the president, survived his assassination in 1968 and went on to secure the party's nomination? He would then face Richard Nixon and Southern independent George C. Wallace. Now, Kennedy already had the nomination pretty much secured before his assassination, and so in this world we can assume he would have a majority of the Democratic Party behind him. However, after after LBJ's involvement in Vietnam and his other policies regarding civil rights, there would be a large chunk of the party splitting off to go to George C. Wallace, and then some going to Richard Nixon, who did not support the war. And to top that off, the conservatives, who were fed up with Johnson, would also probably go to Nixon, although a few of them might go to George C. Wallace, although not many, because keep in mind at the time, Democrats were very much behind racial segregation. They did not like civil rights at all. However, I think RFK could appeal to some moderates and conservatives. Now, let's get into this prediction. I'm going to start in the South with the Wallace states. I think he would pick up every single state that he won in our world. So that's this deeper South region, and I think he would pick up North Carolina as well, because you see, North Carolina in our world split its electoral votes with Richard Nixon. However, with Kennedy on there, I think all of their electoral votes would go to George C. Wallace. So that's the deeper South. That's one front covered. And I think that RFK would win the state of Washington. Hubert Humphrey in our world carried it, and RFK, he definitely has that appeal to the West. However, I am saying that Richard Nixon would win California because it was his home state. And keep in mind, California was at one point one of the most conservative states in the Union. It is not anymore, obviously, but still it was then. Richard Nixon would also win these rural Mountain West states that aren't going to go Democratic anytime soon in the next half century or century, and that includes Utah. And I think Nixon could very narrowly win Colorado. I say narrowly because Kennedy also has that appeal to the rurals. But I'm going to say that Nixon would win the rest of the Mountain West, even all of Nebraska, which did not split its electoral votes this time. Now, going to the East, where Kennedy would win some states. He would win his home state of Massachusetts. He would do very, very, very well in New England. That's where the Kennedys are from. And even if he wasn't too popular, he would still secure those things. Though I'm at those states, forgive me. So that means Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine was a bit of a swing state at this time. It was moving from strict conservative to swing state because keep in mind it was one of the two states that voted for Alf Landon in 1936. However, it did vote for LBJ in 1964, so I think it would go for RFK. And I think RFK would pick up New Hampshire. That was also a swing state at the time. He would win New York. New York's traditionally leaned more Democratic in this time. Now it's pretty much safe with the city and everything, but at this time it was a bit more swingy. However, RFK would win it safely. And obviously DC would go for RFK, the most liberal part of the Union. And RFK would also win West Virginia, which is probably the second most liberal state in the Union at this time. And in the Rust Belt, I'm saying that Nixon wins Indiana, traditionally a conservative state. And I'm going to say that I'm going to go back to Kentucky and Tennessee. I'm going to say that Nixon would win Oklahoma because I think that Wallace couldn't really compete there too well. Neither could RFK. However, I'm going to say that RFK wins Texas. It was LBJ's home state, part of the South this time. And I'm also going to give I'm also going to give RFK New Mexico because, again, New Mexico was a bit of a swing state at this time. Nixon would have that Western appeal. However, I think the RFK support in Texas would flood over to New Mexico, especially with the immigrant voters there, who were there in this time, although you didn't hear much about them. And I think the RFK would win Hawaii, no duh, pretty liberal. Nixon would win Alaska, no duh, pretty conservative. And I'm also going to say that Nixon would win in Arizona. It was also a pretty conservative state at this time. I don't think it was really up for contention. It was one of the few states that went for Barry Goldwater in 1964. It was also Barry Goldwater's home state. I'm going to give RFK Maryland because while I do think George Wallace could have some appeal to the Southerners living in Maryland, it was still pretty liberal at this time. RFK, I'm going to say, would also win Illinois. He could appeal to Chicago, and I think he could appeal to some of the areas like Springfield and some of the rural votes to win in the state. And I'm also going to give him Minnesota. It was trending more liberal at this time. And as we all know, the last time it went Republican was 1972. And I think it went for JFK in 1960. I could be wrong, though. And I think RFK would also win Michigan. Hubert Humphrey won Michigan. And I think the Kennedys were liked in this northern Rust Belt area enough to carry him the state. I think George Wallace would win Arkansas. If I'm not mistaken, that's where his running mate was from. Then again, I could always be mistaken. Nixon would win Virginia. Virginia was a military state at this time, and it didn't go Democrat until I think 2008 was the first time it went Democrat in like 60 years, I believe. Last time it went Democrat was 64. I think that George Wallace, however, could win Kentucky. He would get that rural white appeal there, especially without Humphrey on the ticket. And with Kennedy, I don't think that many Democrats would come out for Kennedy. And I think just enough independents and conservatives would be swayed from Nixon. Kentucky in our timeline was very close. And I'm going to give RFK New Jersey because of his northeastern appeal, and I'm also going to give him Delaware because I think he has that appeal to the Northeast Mid-Atlantic region. And so now we're closing in. I'm going to say that, however, I'm going to predict that Nixon would win Oregon and Nevada. These were two very different states at that time. They were very, very rural. They were very, very red. Pretty much still only Portland votes Democratic, but at this time Portland had even less population than it does now. Plus Nixon was a Western Republican, so he would win the West. And I'm going to say that George Wallace would pick up Tennessee again without Hubert Humphrey, with Robert F. Kennedy and with Richard Nixon. George C. Wallace would perform better in the South than he did in our timeline. However, I'm going to say that I think Richard Nixon would win the state of Florida because I think he has the white appeal. I think he would get some of the older vote too. And now I know at the time Florida wasn't the place to retire. However, it was starting to be. I think Nixon would be the panhandle. RFK would do good in some Miami areas, some areas with high minorities. However, I think RFK would win Pennsylvania. RFK would also win Vermont. Vermont for a long time was the most conservative state in the Union. It is not anymore, simply due to the fact that, Bernie Sanders obviously, but at this time it was very conservative. However, I think it went Democratic for RFK's brother, John F. Kennedy. Plus, the Kennedys from New England. RFK would sweep New England. And I think RFK would win the rest of the Rust Belt, come back to Ohio. And I also think he would win the state of Iowa because at this point, whoever wins Wisconsin and Illinois in 1968 would also win the state of Iowa. And, I'm running short on time here. I got to go soon. So this is going to be my final prediction. I think that Nixon would narrowly win the votes in Missouri simply due to the split between RFK and George Wallace. And then RFK would win Ohio, thus giving him the election. So this has been Emerald Green Eye signing off.